The night sky split apart without warning. A jagged mass, dark and impossibly vast, descended from the heavens, blotting out constellations that had hung undisturbed for millennia. It wasn't a spacecraft as humanity understood the term. It was alive. The surface shimmered with an unsettling rhythm, as though breathing, pulsing faintly with hues of green and black. People stood frozen in streets and fields, staring upward as the air seemed to thicken with an oppressive hum. The broadcast came soon after, not in words but a presence, a psychic invasion that reached into every mind simultaneously. The message was alien, incomprehensible, yet understood. Your dead shall rise to serve us. It began in the cemeteries. Within hours, the ground churned like a living thing, soil erupting in grotesque sprays as skeletal hands clawed free. The dead came first as rotting remnants, dragging themselves from graves, mausoleums, and catacombs. But they didn't stay corpses for long. Alien spores, iridescent and alive, seeped into the soil and consumed the remains, transforming them. The flesh reformed grotesquely, sinews and muscle knitting together with translucent alien tendrils. Their eyes glowed faintly, like dying stars, and their movements were unnatural, jerking and angular, yet purposeful. Mara Owens saw it all. From her apartment overlooking Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, she watched in paralyzed horror as the earth tore itself apart and the first of the resurrected stumbled into the streets. Mara had been a virologist in her former life, though former now seemed a cruel irony as the dead overtook the city. Her phone rang, vibrating against the countertop with a frantic insistence. It was her sister Jenna. Mara snatched it up. "Mara!" Jenna's voice crackled, panic thick in every syllable. "Are you seeing this? They're coming out of the ground. It's everywhere." "I see it," Mara whispered, her throat tight. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. Don't—" The line went dead. Outside, the shambling figures moved with growing coordination, their fractured bodies becoming grotesquely efficient. Tendrils of alien tissue sprouted along their limbs, reinforcing joints and muscles in ways that defied human anatomy. A flash of movement drew Mara's gaze, one of the resurrected sprinting, its speed horrifyingly unnatural. It wasn't just happening here. News feeds lit up her phone with fragmented reports. Moscow, Cairo, New York. Every nation, every city, every unmarked grave in the wilderness, none were spared. The aliens themselves descended days later. Towering, sinewy figures, their bodies rippled with semi-translucent skin that glowed faintly from within. Their faces were featureless except for slitted openings that seemed to pulse with their breath. They moved with an otherworldly grace, silent yet commanding. As they spread across the planet, they established vast hive-like structures that emerged organically from the ground, constructed from their own living flesh and tendrils. The resurrected were drawn to these hives, walking in obedient herds like cattle. Mara's curiosity, rooted in her scientific mind, overpowered her terror as she watched from a safe distance. The hives pulsed with activity, biomechanical appendages extending and retracting as the resurrected were modified further. She spotted one man, a construction worker by the look of his clothing, being absorbed into the hive's outer wall. His body was torn apart and reconstituted, his arms transformed into spiked tools, his torso integrated into the hive itself. Then came the patrols. The aliens directed the resurrected to enforce their will. These new hybrid creatures were stronger, faster, and brutally efficient. Entire neighborhoods were emptied as the living were either slaughtered or captured, their fates unknown. Mara realized she had to move. She packed a bag quickly, her hands shaking as she stuffed in water, food, and a handgun she had barely fired since the day she bought it. As she left the apartment, the air was heavy with an unnatural silence. The streets were littered with the remnants of lives torn apart, abandoned cars, shattered windows, and bloodstains that led nowhere. She saw a group of the resurrected in the distance, standing unnervingly still, their glowing eyes scanning the ruins. It was then she heard the scream. Turning, she saw a man being dragged by two of the resurrected. His legs kicked wildly, his cries echoing down the empty street. One of the hybrids twisted its grotesque head toward her, its eyes locking onto hers. Mara didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran, her breath ragged and heart pounding as she ducked into an alley. In the shadows, she pressed herself against a wall, trembling. She couldn't unsee the man's face or the alien tendrils gripping his arms, pulling him into the unknown. The truth was undeniable now. This wasn't a conquest. It was an assimilation. Mara's mind raced. The resurrected weren't mindless, they were tools, reprogrammed to serve the aliens' unfathomable purpose. But why Earth? Why humanity? She gritted her teeth, determination hardening within her. She would find answers, or die trying. Above her, the sky churned with unnatural light as the alien craft loomed overhead, casting its shadow over a dying world. The smell of the hive was the first thing Mara noticed, a pungent blend of rotting flesh and something sharp and chemical, like acid, hanging in the air. She crouched low behind a mound of alien sinew that pulsed faintly with life. Around her, dozens of resurrected moved with unsettling precision, their alien-enhanced bodies creaking and clicking as they carried strange organic structures deeper into the hive. The walls around them writhed, veins of glowing green liquid coursing through semi-translucent membranes. Mara wasn't alone. Henry Gallows knelt beside her, a rifle slung across his back. He was an imposing figure, his face weathered and hard, but his body told a different story. His once human frame had been grotesquely altered. His left arm was a mass of alien tendrils, ending in a claw-like appendage, and patches of his skin were translucent, revealing pulsating alien musculature beneath. "They don't seem to notice us," Henry muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "Not yet," Mara replied, her gaze fixed on the hive's central chamber in the distance. A massive spire jutted upward, its surface alive with shifting patterns of alien bioluminescence. It was here the resurrected were brought for processing. Processing. The word alone made Mara's stomach churn. She had seen it firsthand when Clara, a former nurse and one of their few allies, was dragged into the hive weeks ago. The aliens had fused her with a biomechanical exoskeleton, her legs replaced with insectoid limbs, and her back fitted with pulsating, organic machinery. When Clara returned, she was different, still herself in moments, but broken, her voice tinged with an alien undertone. Now Clara worked with them, hiding her allegiance to the Revenants while pretending to be loyal to the Hive. Mara wasn't sure how much longer Clara could maintain the act. "I don't like it," Henry growled, breaking the silence. "We're sitting ducks here." Mara couldn't argue. Every instinct told her they were exposed, vulnerable in this grotesque environment. But they needed intel. The Hive's central node was their only lead, the place where the aliens' plans were most likely to be revealed. They waited until the patrols passed, then moved quickly, staying low. The Hive's interior was a labyrinth of organic corridors, their surfaces sticky and warm to the touch. Fleshy appendages hung from the ceiling, twitching occasionally as though sensing their presence. Mara shivered but pressed on, her heart hammering in her chest. As they approached the central chamber, they found Clara waiting for them. She stood unnervingly still, her insectoid limbs clicking softly against the floor. Her glowing eyes locked on to Mara and Henry as they approached. "You're late," Clara said, her voice a disconcerting blend of human and alien tones. "Had to make sure we weren't followed," Henry replied, his hand tightening around his rifle. Clara's expression flickered with something like pain, but she quickly masked it. "The central node is up ahead," she said, gesturing toward a towering structure in the middle of the chamber. "It's heavily guarded. You'll need to be careful." Mara nodded, her gaze lingering on Clara. She wanted to say something, anything, but there was no time. They moved as a group, slipping into the shadows as they approached the node. The chamber was massive, its walls lined with pods that pulsed with light. Inside each pod was a human, their bodies in various stages of transformation. Some were barely recognizable, their features twisted and fused with alien tissue. Mara's stomach turned, but she forced herself to keep moving. At the base of the node, a group of aliens stood motionless, their featureless faces turned toward the spire as though in silent communion. Mara motioned for the others to stop, then gestured toward a nearby alcove. "We'll have to disable the guards," she whispered. "How?" Henry asked, his voice a low growl. Mara hesitated. They had no weapons that could match the aliens' power. But she had studied their biology, observed their vulnerabilities during her time in hiding. She pointed to a cluster of glowing veins running along the chamber walls. "If we sever those, it might disrupt their connection to the Hive," she said. Henry nodded, already moving toward the veins. Clara followed, her insectoid limbs allowing her to move silently across the floor. Mara stayed behind, keeping watch as they worked. It didn't take long for things to go wrong. As Henry severed the first vein, the chamber shuddered violently, a deafening roar echoing through the Hive. The aliens turned in unison, their glowing eyes locking onto the intruders. "Run!" Mara shouted, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her toward the exit. Henry fired his rifle, the sound cutting through the chaos as he took down one of the aliens. But more were coming, their movements eerily fluid as they closed in. Mara and Clara reached the corridor, but Henry was still behind them, his rifle blazing. "Go!" he shouted, his voice full of defiance. Mara hesitated for only a moment before pulling Clara forward. They ran through the Hive's twisting corridors, the sounds of battle echoing behind them. When they finally emerged into the open air, Mara collapsed against a nearby wall, her chest heaving. Clara stood beside her, her glowing eyes fixed on the hive in the distance. "He didn't make it," Clara said softly. Mara didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she turned her gaze to the hive, its pulsing glow a grim reminder of the battle they faced. The mission had failed, but they had learned one thing. The aliens were vulnerable, even if only slightly, and Mara would use that knowledge to strike again. The hive burned behind them, its walls collapsing inward as veins of bioluminescent tissue ruptured and spilled glowing ichor. Mara could still hear the screams, human and alien alike, echoing in her ears. Henry was gone, his sacrifice buying her and Clara the few precious seconds they needed to escape. But there was no time to mourn. The hive was one of many, and the aliens were already retaliating. The revenants regrouped in the shadow of a crumbling city, a half-dozen figures huddled in the remains of a gutted skyscraper, their twisted, resurrected forms blending into the dim light. Each of them bore the scars of the aliens' experiments. Clara with her insectoid limbs, Johann with his left arm replaced by a writhing mass of alien tendrils, and others who carried their own grotesque transformations. "We can't stop," Mara said, her voice cutting through the grim silence. "That hive was just the beginning. If we don't hit another one soon, they'll adapt. They'll make sure we don't get another chance." Johann, his pale skeletal face half covered by a membrane of translucent alien flesh, shook his head. "You saw what happened back there. We lost Henry. We almost lost all of us. Another attack like that and we're done." "We don't have a choice," Mara snapped. "If we wait, they'll finish whatever they're doing. You've seen the pods. You've seen what's happening to the people they take. Do you want to end up like them?" The group fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. Clara shifted uneasily, her mechanical legs clicking against the floor. "She's right," she said quietly. "We're running out of time. The longer we wait, the more they'll reinforce their hives. And we all know what's coming if they activate the seed." The primordial seed. The name alone was enough to fill the group with dread. Rhinoc, a hybrid who had once been human but now bore the unmistakable traits of the aliens, had revealed its existence during a desperate act of rebellion. Buried deep beneath the aliens' primary hive, the seed was a living organism designed to terraform the planet into a biosphere compatible with the invaders. If it reached full maturity, Earth would be consumed, its atmosphere, soil, and water transformed into something entirely alien. Mara stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, a reminder of the alien modifications forced upon her. "We hit their supply lines, disrupt the flow of resources to their hives. It's the only way we'll weaken them enough to make a move on the seed." "How do you expect us to do that?" Johann asked bitterly. "We're barely holding together as it is. They've turned us into monsters, and you want us to fight back?" Mara stepped closer to him, her glowing eyes boring into his. "Exactly. They made us into this. And that's why we can fight them. We know how they think. We know how they work. And we know their weaknesses." Johann didn't respond, but the tension in his face softened slightly. The first target was a convoy transporting biomechanical components to a nearby hive. The revenants struck under cover of darkness, using their twisted forms to blend into the night. Clara and Johann led the charge, their modified bodies moving with inhuman speed and precision. The battle was brutal, the air filled with the wet sounds of flesh, tearing and the sharp cracks of alien weapons. Mara worked quickly, planting charges on the convoy's central transport while the others held off the guards. Her hands, now partially fused with alien tissue, moved with a speed and strength that still unnerved her. As the last charge clicked into place, she shouted for the others to fall back. The explosion lit up the night, a searing wave of heat and light that sent the alien convoy into chaos. The Revenants retreated, their victory marred by the loss of 2 more members. The success of the attack sent ripples through the alien network. For the first time, the resurrected were seen as a threat. The aliens responded with brutal efficiency, deploying patrols and purging entire areas where resistance was suspected. Cities were reduced to smoldering ruins, their inhabitants slaughtered or captured. But something else began to happen. Among the resurrected, whispers spread. Stories of defiance, of hybrids fighting back against their creators. In the shadows of the alien hives, small groups began to form, fragmented and desperate, but united by a common purpose. The Revenants were no longer alone. Mara and her group became symbols of the resistance, their actions inspiring others to rise up. But with each victory came greater risks. The aliens' retaliations grew more severe, and their methods more insidious. Entire regions were flooded with bioplagues, grotesque swarms of parasitic creatures that consumed everything in their path. As the Revenants prepared for their next mission, Mara felt the weight of the rebellion pressing down on her. She stood at the edge of a ruined city, the distant glow of a hive illuminating the horizon. "We're getting closer," Clara said, joining her. "Closer to what?" Mara asked, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "To the end," Clara replied. "One way or another." Mara didn't respond. She stared out at the hive, its pulsating glow a reminder of everything they had lost and everything they still had to fight for. In the distance, the faint sound of alien patrols grew louder. The war was far from over, but for the first time Mara felt a flicker of hope. The dead were revolting, and the aliens had underestimated them. The air near the main hive was suffocating, heavy with the stench of decay and the acrid tang of alien spores. The pulsating structure loomed above them, its surface alive with shifting patterns of bioluminescent veins. Tendrils extended into the ground, burrowing deep into the earth like parasitic roots, feeding on the planet's core. This was it, the heart of the invaders' operation, the cradle of the primordial seed. Mara led the group forward, every step a battle against the instinctive fear that clawed at their minds. The hive's pulsations seemed to sync with their hearts, a rhythmic reminder of the alien presence that had consumed their world. Beside her, Clara moved with unsettling speed, her insectoid limbs clicking softly against the ground. Johann followed, his tendril arm twitching nervously as if sensing the hive's hostility. Behind them marched the remnants of the Revenants. Their grotesque altered forms were a patchwork of alien modifications, their bodies a living testament to the horrors they had endured. They were a fractured army, beaten and scarred, but united by purpose. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Infiltrate the hive, plant charges at critical points, and destroy the seed before it could be activated. But the cost of failure was clear. If the seed reached full maturity, it would consume the planet's biosphere in a matter of days, leaving Earth a barren, alien wasteland. The entrance to the hive yawned before them, a grotesque maw of writhing flesh and cartilage. Mara hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, her breath catching as the temperature dropped sharply. The walls seemed to close in around them, slick with a viscous substance that glowed faintly in the darkness. "This is wrong," Johann muttered, his voice barely audible. "This whole place, it's alive." "Keep moving," Mara said, her voice steadier than she felt. The deeper they went, the more grotesque the hive became. The walls pulsed as if breathing, and strange organic growths jutted out at odd angles, some oozing a luminescent fluid. They passed chambers filled with half-formed creatures suspended in translucent pods, their twitching movements a grim preview of what awaited the captured humans. Then they heard it, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the hive. It wasn't speech, but a presence, a force that pressed down on their minds. Mara clutched her head, her vision swimming as an overwhelming sense of dread flooded her senses. "It knows we're here," Clara whispered, her voice tinged with fear. Suddenly, the hive came alive. Tendrils shot out from the walls, writhing and snapping as they reached for the intruders. Mara dove to the side, narrowly avoiding one of the appendages as it slammed into the ground where she had been standing. "Move!" she shouted, firing her weapon at the tendrils. The shots burned into the living walls, causing them to writhe in pain, but the assault only intensified. The group pushed forward, their movements frantic as the hive seemed to close in around them. Mara's heart pounded as they reached the central chamber, a vast, cathedral-like space dominated by the primordial seed. It was massive, a pulsating mass of flesh and sinew that glowed with a sickly green light. Tendrils extended from its base, spreading across the chamber floor and up the walls, feeding on the hive's energy. The seed pulsed in time with the hive, its movements hypnotic and horrifying. "We have to plant the charges," Mara said, her voice shaking. The group spread out, each member moving to a predetermined location. Johann's tendril arm extended, fusing with the hive's surface as he worked to override its defenses. Clara climbed the walls with inhuman speed, placing charges high above the seed's base. As Mara approached the seed, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Its surface shimmered, and for a moment she thought she saw faces, human faces, pressing against the membrane, their expressions frozen in agony. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the chamber. Mara turned to see Overseer Otha descending from above, its massive, sinewy form radiating a blinding light. It moved with terrifying grace, its elongated limbs slicing through the air as it landed between the group and the seed. "You will not stop the evolution," Othar said, its voice resonating inside their minds. "Your world will become ours. You will serve." Mara raised her weapon, firing at the Overseer. The shots struck its translucent skin, but Othar barely flinched, its wounds healing almost instantly. It lunged forward, its clawed limbs striking with blinding speed. Johann screamed as Othar's arm pierced his chest, lifting him off the ground before tossing him aside like a rag doll. Clara attacked from above, her insectoid limbs slicing into Othar's back. The overseer roared, its body twisting unnaturally as it flung her away. Mara seized the opportunity, sprinting toward the seed with the detonator in hand. The overseer turned, its glowing eyes locking onto her. "You cannot destroy what is inevitable," it said, its voice a chilling monotone. Mara's fingers trembled as she pressed the detonator against the seed's surface. "You're wrong," she said through gritted teeth. "Nothing about this is inevitable." Othar lunged toward her, but a sudden explosion rocked the chamber. Rhinoc, the alien hybrid who had joined their cause, had reappeared, his twisted form grappling with the overseer. "Go!" Rhinoc shouted, his voice a blend of human defiance and alien strength. Mara didn't hesitate. She activated the charges, the detonator's light blinking red as a countdown began. She turned and ran, the chamber collapsing around her as the seed writhed and screamed. The explosions consumed the hive in a cascade of fire and light. Mara barely made it to the surface, her body battered and broken as she collapsed onto the ground. Behind her, the hive imploded, the pulsating structure crumbling into itself until nothing remained but a smoldering crater. For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the sky began to clear. The oppressive presence that had hung over the planet lifted, and the stars shone through the darkness once more. Mara lay on the ground, staring up at the night sky. She was alive, but the cost had been unimaginable. Around her, the surviving revenants emerged, their twisted forms illuminated by the faint light of dawn. The aliens were gone, their plans thwarted. But the world they had left behind was irrevocably changed. The resurrected were free, but their bodies bore the marks of what had been done to them. Mara closed her eyes, the weight of exhaustion and grief overwhelming her. The fight was over, but the struggle to rebuild was just beginning. And in the quiet of the aftermath, as the first light of day broke over the horizon, she allowed herself a single thought. We survived.